Hello and welcome to episode 310 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert, as always, Damien, Faye and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, Andy, but I've got a confession for you, which is I've basically done a spot of moonlighting this week and gone and and I'm glad you laughed and you took it in good spirit, but I've gone on to another podcast. It's not been published yet, but the Financial Times asked me to appear on their podcast as an expert in relation to investing, and in particular a young person who wants to get into investing, who's been doing a lot of day trading, and I was giving my views and advice. So I've appeared on another podcast. I know there are many listeners to our podcast who also listen to the Financial Times because I've seen them mention it in the Money to the Masses Facebook group. So there'll be a nice surprise for them. I think it's out next week, but obviously, Andy, I've been off, as I say, moonlighting with other people.
That's okay. I won't judge, and I'm sure their editing will be up to scratch. No, that's okay though, Damien, because that then opens up for me being able to appear on other people's podcasts. So I might drop it. I don't know which podcast it will be. If there's any podcast producers out there, get me on it, because next week I want to say to Damien I've been moonlighting too.
Like a spurned lover, Andy, that's going to go, right, yeah. If you can go and play away, I'm going to play away too. Right, I'm going to move things on because I'm conscious we've got so much content on this week, and it's going to be another packed show of insight. So I'm going to tell you right away what is on the podcast this week. And as promised, I'm going to do a piece about trivial commutation and small pension pots. And it's so good that you guys all email in and contact us, because I'd actually forgotten that I'd promised to do that. And it was only because one of you wrote in and said, I'm looking forward to that piece, that Andy and I laughed about it and said, I was lucky that they wrote in, because I'd completely forgotten what I'd said last week, because a lot goes on in Money to the Masses in 1 week. I'm also going to do a piece on income investing, but in particular, disaster proofing your income portfolio. So making a sustainable income stream. And it is off the back of some research I've done for 80/20 investor members, but I can give you some real key findings, and off the back of what happened in 2020. So in 2020, dividends were cut and income streams were decimated for investors. And I did a lot of analysis that is going to prove very timeless, to be honest. It's not just relevant to now. And there's going to be some insights to take away. And finally, quite excitingly, we've got Harvey back on the show. So Harvey, who is our insurance expert, who knows everything there is to know about the world of insurance in terms of income protection, life insurance, critical illness cover. She's on the show this week to discuss BMI, height and weight. We've all been in lockdown. We've all pretty much piled on a few more pounds than we would like. And it's the impact that has on life insurance. There's a lot of people who have been asking questions such as, should I put off applying for life insurance right now until I get fit again after lockdown? So we're going to explore that whole concept about what people should be doing.
Okay, so let's move on to the pension piece first. We promised it last week, and thank goodness for the last minute heads up. We're now doing it this week. It's about sort of transferring over those small pension pots, isn't it?
Yeah, so last week we talked about consolidating pensions, and there was a point that I made in passing about small pension pots and about cashing them in. And it was a consideration for people who have pensions that they're thinking of putting together that are very small, that they may want to bear in mind the fact that there are certain benefits of having small pension pots that they may be losing if they consolidate. Now, I want to quickly run through the rules here. I'm not going to dwell on them, but to give people an overview, because there are some real nuances which we will link through to a range of articles in the show notes and on the website. So if you go to the website, there is always an article for every podcast episode, and we will link through on there to specific articles where you can find much more detail on this topic. So this piece is referring to cashing in small pension pots. So that could be a defined benefit scheme, which is also called a final salary scheme, or something called a defined contribution scheme, where you put money into a pension and that pot grows as a pot of money, which you can then use to derive an income in retirement. Now, going back before pension freedoms came about in 2015, there was a rule called trivial commutation that covered all of this stuff about what you could do in terms of cashing in small pension pots. Now, pension freedoms allowed, obviously, as the name suggests, a lot more freedom. And in terms of defined contributions, the ability to just cash pension pots in anyway, regardless of size, was suddenly allowed. So the rules of commutation changed. They weren't as relevant. So what we have now is a situation where trivial commutation rules, if you search that phrase, you'll come across all of this stuff. It will be encompassed in nearly any article covering this topic. Now, cashing in defined benefit pensions come under the trivial commutation rules, whereas defined contribution pots, so things like personal pensions, they fall under what is called the small pot rules. That's how it's set up now. Now, I'm going to just quickly run through the rules for small pots. So this is relating to defined contributions. Now, they relate to crystallised and uncrystallised funds, and you have to be over age 55 or in ill health to be able to access these small pots. And technically, these small pot rules do actually apply to defined benefit schemes as well. But most of the time it will be used in relation to defined contribution schemes. That could be occupational or personal pensions. Now, the rules are that if you have a personal pension, and they call it in regard to personal pensions an arrangement, if the arrangement is less than £10,000 in value, then you are able to cash that in as long as it's going to extinguish any rights you have to that scheme or pension. You can do that and it not impact your money purchase annual allowance or your lifetime allowance. There's no impact at all, and you don't even need to have any lifetime allowance left in regard to pensions. So you can look up those phrases if you don't understand them. We've covered the money purchase annual allowance previously, but very briefly, your annual allowance you can pay into a pension is up to £40,000 or your earnings. That's the limit that you can put in each tax year. If you access a pension on a defined contribution scheme, that can fall down to £4,000 per tax year. So people don't necessarily realise this rule exists. So you have to be careful if you're still planning on contributing to a pension, including a company pension of some kind. Now, the key point here is that under pension freedoms, you can cash in personal pensions. We know that. But it's the part where it doesn't impact the money purchase annual allowance. It's what quite interesting, why people might still want to use the small pot rules. So if they've got up to 3 of them, they can then cash in them if they're less than £10,000 and it not impact their lifetime annual allowance or their money purchase annual allowance. Now, earlier I mentioned about the value of the arrangements and didn't say pension pot because actually there's a nuance in that definition. Now, normally a value of the arrangement has to be less than £10,000. So that is typically the pension pot that we are talking about. But it is possible for a pension to have more than one arrangement in it. So there is a weird technicality that is a possibility that a personal pension has more than one arrangement in it. So you could actually have multiple arrangements in it that are valued at less than £10,000. So it is a nuance, which is why I was very particular about using the word arrangements. Now, with regard to occupational schemes, then it's based upon the value of the scheme. Now, it's interesting because there's a nuance in the word scheme and arrangement. It was arrangement with personal pensions. With a company scheme, it's actually the word scheme. That has to be worth less than £10,000. Again, it has to extinguish your right if you cash in the pension to any benefits from that scheme. Now, interestingly, there's no limit to how many times you can do that. If you have these small pots in occupational schemes, you can have lots of them and you can cash them in, and it won't impact your lifetime annual allowance or trigger that money purchase annual allowance either. And there are some small rules as well in there, caveats. You can't be a controlling director and there can't have been any transfers in the last 3 years. So you can see that's why when you're talking about consolidating, this is almost a rule that most people are overlooked now. Now we've got pension freedoms. That is something to bear in mind, and they should seek advice if they're thinking about consolidating and they're unsure whether they could benefit from any of these rules. Now, if we jump across to defined benefit schemes, final salary, this falls under the trivial commutation rules. Now, like I said, the small pot rules apply to defined benefit, but these trivial commutation rules are in addition, and they basically state that you can commute all of the pension into a lump sum and cash it in where the pension benefit is less than £30,000. And that's all your pensions. That's not just that scheme. That's every benefit you have in existence. So that includes your personal pensions. It doesn't include your state pension. So if you've got pension benefits more than £30,000 anywhere, and even if you have a small final salary scheme, now I say the £30,000, that is based upon a valuation. They have to value the final salary scheme because final salary schemes are based on paying you out a benefit in relation to your final salary, hence the name, and length of service. That's usually how it will work. So the valuation is usually based around about 20 times the annual pension and tax-free cash added to that number. So you can look up more information about how they value it, but broadly the value of those benefits plus everything else you have has to be less than £30,000. And we're not talking about public sector schemes here, final salary public sector schemes. There's a whole different rules in relation to what you can do with those, because there are some you can't actually encash in any way, not even if you transfer them to a defined contribution scheme. We're going to put a link in the show notes about final salary transfers if you want to find out more in relation to public sector schemes. But the general rule of thumb is that obviously you should keep them rather than transfer and consolidate them into a defined contribution scheme. So the point here is that if you have benefits that are less than £30,000 in entirety and you have a small final salary pension, then you can encash that and you don't have to take advice. You do have to have some lifetime annual allowance. It doesn't stipulate in the rules that I've seen that says how much that allowance has to be. But when you do it, it doesn't impact your annual allowance and it doesn't impact the money purchase annual allowance, how much you can contribute going forward into a pension. So those are the broad rules around cashing in small pension pots. So there's a trivial commutation, look that up, that relates to defined benefits. And of course, we've got the small pot rules that largely relates to defined contribution, can apply to defined benefit schemes too. But we've linked in the show notes to the full details that people can go and find examples. But what it means as well, if people think about some of the stuff I've just spoken about, that it's crucial that people think about the order in which they access pensions, because there are examples in some of the notes that we attach to this show that highlight the order is important. So, for example, if you had a final salary scheme that was valued at about £28,000 and you had a personal pension that was valued at, say, £9,000, by definition, you wouldn't be able to use trivial commutation rules on the final salary scheme because you had total pension benefits that were over £30,000. However, through the examples that I've seen on the technical guidance from various pension providers, if you were to encash the pension first, because it's smaller than £10,000 under the small pot rules, you could do that. Then if you were to go to the final salary scheme, because your total benefits now are less than 30,000, you could look to use the trivial commutation rules to be able to access that. So the order is important. But also there's an example that we include in these show notes that highlights that if you have two pensions, for example, so we're talking defined contribution pensions here, and you went to access them, if you had a small pot and you access that was less than £10,000, it doesn't impact your money purchase annual allowance. Let's say you had a bigger pot and you decided to access a similar sum out of that bigger pot, but actually ended up drawing benefits in excess of your tax-free cash, for example, you took an income, that could hit your money purchase annual allowance. Does that make sense? So you could have actually got the same amount of money out by encashing the smaller pension pot without impacting your money purchase annual allowance, meaning that you could still contribute up to £40,000 a year into a pension. So the order is important. That's why these rules, people need to be aware that they exist. And if you think you can use any of them, then by all means look at the various articles that we've included, but do seek advice, because once you do something and you make a decision and you enact upon it, then it can have implications going forward. So in all instances, when you're trying to access benefits, I always favour seeking financial advice. So there you go. That's something to bear in mind ahead of consolidating pensions.
Okay, moving on to disaster proofing. And this is in relation to income portfolios. Damien, what we got?
So if you think about how you could derive an income from a portfolio, as a general rule of thumb, if you want to produce an inflation-beating income throughout your retirement, say, for example, then if you're doing it via an unsecured income route, so you're not using anything of like some kind of annuity, one way would be you would invest and draw the natural yield from a portfolio. So it doesn't have to be in retirement. If you're before retirement and you produce a portfolio you want to produce an income from, then one of the best ways to do it is to use equities. because by their nature, the dividends that they will likely produce over time will increase. And that's because of economic growth. Now, obviously, some people will invest directly into equities themselves. They'll buy the company shares directly and they will take the dividend that comes from that company. Obviously, that's a higher risk strategy because if a company cuts their dividend for some reason, then your income disappears. A more diversified way to do it is to invest in equity income funds. So you invest in funds that provide a income payout, which is achieved by investing in a whole load of companies that pay dividends. And so the whole range of equity incomes out there. Primarily, there's a lot of UK equity income funds. Most of them are unit trusts, and there's global ones as well. And there are also investment trusts as something to consider. And I'll come on to that in a second. Now, every year for 80/20 investor members, I sit there and crunch the pound and pence payouts of these funds to see that which ones are growing their payouts. Because as an investor, it's very hard to tell. You sit there and think, I'm going to build an income portfolio. I'm going to pick some funds, and you look at the yield that they're quoting and you think, I'm going to go for that fund, and then you're disappointed because it doesn't achieve the income that you want or they cut their payouts. And what is better is to look at the historical payouts that these funds have made in pounds and pence and see how they've changed over the years. And I've done that going back 14 years. So I've analysed the pounds and pence paid out by all of these different funds and then compared them each year and see if they've gone up and down. And by doing so, I created heat maps for income investors on 80/20 Investor. Now, I updated that for this year to see what happened in 2020. Now, we know that 2020 was a bit of a disaster for income investors because of the pandemic. Profits were cut or expectations for future profits were reduced. And it meant that companies slashed or completely got rid of any dividend payments. Well, the knock-on effect is that for funds that were relying on those dividends to therefore make a payout, it would have impacted their payouts. So all of the different dividends that come into the fund manager would have been reduced, and therefore the likelihood is it would impact their ability to grow the income from the previous year in 2019 ahead of inflation. So here are some key findings. If you want to look at the individual funds, you need to sign up to 80/20 Investor, and you can see I look at fund by fund and show you what they've done.
And of course, there's a free trial for that if members want to give it a go for 30 days, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so you could technically build an income portfolio very quickly based upon that historical reliability. Now, some key findings. If you look at the UK equity income funds, so the unit trusts out there, out of the 44 that were analysed, not a single one of them managed to maintain or grow their payout in 2020. All of them slashed the payout in income. And the average fall in income payout from a UK equity income unit trust was 29.73% from 2019 to 2020, which means that the income that you would have been paid was about almost a third smaller than the previous year. And the range of cuts was quite wide. There were some funds where the reduction was 4.23%, up to some funds where the reduction in income payouts compared to the previous year was a reduction of 76%. So there's a wide range, but the definite trend was if you were investing in UK equity income unit trusts, you had a bad year. Now, if you look back at what happened in the financial crisis, most funds, again, cut their payouts, but it was nothing like what we saw in 2020. And even the funds that had managed to maintain payouts back in the financial crisis, even they couldn't achieve that feat in 2020. Now, the average yield at the moment on a UK equity income fund is about 4.26%. Now, we're hoping that the economy is going to grow and boom and dividends are going to be reinstated, and 2021 is going to be a much better year. If we go and look at the global equity income unit trust universe, there are much fewer options, but you can invest in income funds that invest in companies globally. Now, 4 out of the 27 of those funds actually managed to grow their payout in 2020, despite what was going on because of the pandemic. And that shows you the benefit of diversifying your income stream. There's a tendency for UK investors to only think about the UK. And I know when they hear about us talk about growth, so you're trying to grow your pot, about diversifying your portfolio, but the same principle applies to income generation. You should diversify how you do it, because when you get a scenario like we've had with the pandemic, if you don't diversify, then you're going to be hit harder. And of course, you're trying to live off that money as well. Now, the average cut on a global equity income fund payout in 2020 compared to 2019 was 12.8%. So it's much lower than the cut for UK equity income funds. And the range was much narrower as well. So those who had a global exposure to their income portfolio would have fared better. And now the average yield for a global equity income fund is slightly smaller, and it's around about 3.37%, which is perhaps not surprising because UK equities have taken a bit of a battering over the last year. Now, this is where it becomes very interesting. Investment trusts, by their nature, should be at the core of any income portfolio because they should do better when it comes to generating a sustainable income stream over time. And the reason for that is that investment trusts can keep back 15% gross income in reserve each year to be able to smooth over the periods when dividends fall, so they can therefore try and maintain or increase payouts. And in addition, there is the possibility that some will charge fees against the capital rather than the income. And in some instances, there are some investment trusts that have been given permission to use capital to pay payouts to investors, even when income has fallen. So they've paid it out of capital, but that isn't something that's sustainable because effectively they're cashing in assets to be able to pay an income stream, which you wouldn't want to see over the long term. Theoretically, therefore, investment trusts, as I've spoken about on the podcast previously, should form a part of an income portfolio. Well, 2020 put that to the test. Now, out of the 33 investment trusts that I analysed, and they're across a range of sectors, UK equities and also Asian equities, so in the global. So 33 investment trusts, 28 of them either grew their payouts or maintained them. And actually, there was only 2 that just maintained them. So 26 grew their payouts out of 33. So it was only 5 investment trusts who cut their payouts in 2020, despite the disaster it was for dividends last year. Now, the average increase was actually 2.93%, which is well ahead of inflation. And the yield on the average investment trust is 4.61% at the moment. So that's across, again, geographies that I've analysed. And there is the ability for investment trusts to trade at a premium or a discount to their net asset value. So that can have quite an impact on the volatility of the capital value. But as an income investor, that is a secondary concern because you're more worried about living off the income. Now, the message clearly here is the benefit of using investment trusts if you want to produce an income. And now, if you go back, there are investment trusts that have grown their payouts for 50, 60 years straight, continue to do so. And the average 3-year growth, so you go back 2020, 2019 and 2018, the average annual growth in those payouts across that period for investment trusts is 4.6% a year. That's very good given the rate of inflation that we're experiencing at the moment. So, like I say, if you want to see the individual records and breakdowns and yields for all of these funds, then that is in 80/20 Investor. But as a podcast listener, the thing you should take away is when you try and build an equity income portfolio or someone gives you advice about doing so, they almost certainly should be including investment trusts in it. Because if you're buying and hold them for the long term as well, some people might point to the fact there can be trading costs when you purchase them, but they will pale into insignificance if you are able to produce that sustainable income over the long term.
Brilliant stuff. That is fascinating, Damien. And it's good for me to be able to sit back and listen. Look, you're the guy who knows about investing. I try my best to know as much as possible, but I am guided by you. And I understood all that. What I've sort of taken from that is the fact that investment trusts actually do something a little bit different, something that unit trusts can't do, which is holding back that extra bit of income to help smooth and flatten out any sort of rocky roads ahead. So that's really interesting. I've learned something new today. Great stuff.
Yep, that's exactly right, Andy.
Okay, and so moving on to the last piece of the podcast, we're going to invite back Harvey onto the podcast. And Harvey is the insurance editor at Money to the Masses, doing lots and lots of work, helping people understand how insurance works and actually starting to hammer down the door of those people that aren't quite doing things right, which is great for us. And where Harvey is qualified to do things like that, and just to fill you in on a history, Harvey spent 20 years in the industry working through the ranks of being an administration assistant and then head of customer service, and then even on to advising thousands of customers and clients about life insurance and recommending products to them. So she's really well placed to do this next piece in the pod. So Harvey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I tell you what, Harvey, it's almost by popular demand, because after we did the show where we had that whole team on, people wrote in and said they wanted to hear more from all of you guys, we just found it another excuse to get you on, basically. And just to highlight to people what happened is that this piece fits nicely with the whole lockdown scenario. We've all put on weight during lockdown because obviously lack of exercise and just sitting at home drinking and eating. And we actually had a question that came in via email where somebody had been declined life insurance because of their height and weight. And so this is something that is particularly relevant to people who are now thinking about maybe buying a house, who are going to take out life insurance inevitably to cover the mortgage, or they might be thinking of taking out any type of insurance, whether it's income protection, health insurance. And a lot of people might be thinking, do you know what, I'm going to wait until I get back to my fighting weight before I apply. And I wanted Harvey to come on and explain how height and weight works in the life insurance world. So Harvey, explain to me or the listeners how it works in the life insurance world. What impact does height and weight have on an insurance application?
Life insurance companies basically look at your build in combination with your overall risk in terms of your health, any health conditions you have, anything else that they seem to think might reduce your lifespan or make you more prone to becoming ill, any of those sorts of things. So build is made up of your BMI, which they can calculate using your height and weight, but you can do that yourself as well. And they will combine that with other measurements like your waist size or your dress size if you're a woman, to work out whether they either need to charge you more for the life insurance or they can't cover you, which unfortunately the person who emailed us had experienced.
So the BMI stands for body mass index. So I'm guessing, the range of what the life insurance companies deem as acceptable. And what is that? So I suppose the two parts: how do you work out your body mass index, and what is deemed as acceptable by them, so it doesn't actually increase your premiums or lead to being declined for life insurance altogether?
Yeah, different companies will have different ranges that they can accept without an increase to the premiums that you pay, or before they start declining you. So those ranges will vary. But you can go to the NHS website and you can calculate your own BMI. So the website is www.nhs.uk/live-healthy-weight/BMI-calculator. And that will bring up a little box and you punch in your height and your weight and it will tell you what your BMI is. Now, the NHS calculator obviously is pushing people towards being healthy. So it will say that you're overweight from about a BMI of 25. But the important thing to note is that insurance companies have a larger tolerance. So you can, in fact, be accepted at the normal rates for life insurance right up to BMIs of 33, 34, 35, with companies dependent on your age as well. So just to expand on the age bandings, I mentioned a little bit about there being greater tolerances as you get older. Do bear that in mind. So if you are checking your BMI and you sort of think that you might be outside of the normal limits, as we get older, we all put on a little bit of weight, and insurance companies expect that. So the tolerances are greater as you get older. So you'll find that BMIs that are higher might still be acceptable to the insurance company if you're slightly older.
So that's quite interesting, because the typical range on the NHS calculator, when we were looking at it before, was between 18 to 25, which anything outside of that they would deem as having a detrimental impact on your health. But life insurance companies are a bit more generous, which is obviously something optimistic for people who are worried about their BMI perhaps being too high, that they could actually get life insurance, or it won't be more expensive because of that.
Exactly. I mean, the tolerances are greater, and with some companies you'll find they're much greater than other companies. So what they're looking at is really at what point does that height and weight increase your cardiac risk to a point where they think it's going to affect your lifespan. If you're looking at just life insurance, for example. If you're looking at other kinds of insurances, so you might be like the lady who emailed us, you might be looking at critical illness cover, or you might be looking at income protection. Now, critical illness cover and income protection have lower thresholds for that tolerance because they pay out if you become ill. And obviously carrying more weight than you should is more likely to cause health problems than death, So in essence, the risk is greater for illness policies than for death policies. But for death policies, the tolerances are quite wide, and they are greater than what the NHS indicate on the website. But I think that's partly down to the fact that the NHS is pushing us all to take better care of ourselves. And they give you good information in terms of what weight you should be, what weight range is appropriate for you as well.
So let me just think of a few almost practical questions that people will have. So let's say they look at their BMI, they know it's more than it would have been before. Then your advice, I'm assuming, would be that people should still apply for life insurance, even with their current BMI, even if they think they're not at their fighting weight, rather than not have protection.
Absolutely, always. The thing that we can never predict, we don't have crystal balls, we don't know what's around the corner. And unfortunately, I've probably in my career seen too many people who had put off buying life insurance only to then be diagnosed with a health problem that actually made it more difficult or more costly for them to take out that cover that they wanted. And, hindsight is a great thing. Most people wish they'd done it before something bad came about. So I'd never recommend to people to put off buying the insurance. But it's really important to bear in mind that if you think you're sort of the upper end of the scale in terms of BMIs and you want to get the best results, then you should speak to a specialist and be upfront and say, look, this is my height and weight, and I want to be able to secure the best rates. I want to be accepted for the insurance, so that, you've got the best chance of getting the best rates now. And then you can always review things in the future.
Because that's one of the things on the website, Money to the Masses, we have an article about this, which people can look at, will help them find specialists that they can talk to. One of the things that I wanted to pick up on there, Harvey, was let's say they going to apply for life insurance now anyway, because like you say, they need to be covered because something could happen in the interim and they could die and therefore their mortgage isn't covered, for example, or the family would have no money to live on because they were the main breadwinner. Now, at what point, if they took out life insurance today with the elevated BMI, then going forward, what's your view or advice in terms of when they should review, or their options in terms of reviewing? Is there a set period they have to wait? Do they have to use the same company? Could they just go elsewhere tomorrow?
Number of things there, Damien. So if you're in a situation where you've either had a premium increase, so the rate that you're paying is higher because of your BMI, you can pay that high rate, and at a point where you feel your BMI is now within normal levels. Remember, you can always ask for that information. So at that point, I would be inclined to ask either the advisor that I was dealing with or the insurance company for what weight, I would need to be in order to have that premium reviewed. If they tell you that and you do manage to hit that weight, some companies will want to see you maintain that weight for at least 12 months before they start reviewing the cost of your policy, because as many of us experience, we lose weight and then we gain it very quickly back. So,
yep.
And we can kind of yo-yo between certain weights. So they don't really want to reduce the cost down if actually what you've done is you've gone on a big crash diet and you're likely just to pile the pounds right back on again. So what they might say to you is that you need to wait 12 months before they'll review the cost of your policy. There's nothing stopping you at that point shopping around for insurance, but remember that you'll be asked all of your health questions again. You'll have to go through the same process as you did with your original insurance company over again. So if anything else has changed about your health, if anything else has changed about your hobbies, your pursuits, any of the things that are asked about, then that might be not as useful an exercise as you maybe initially thought it was. But there are people whose situations won't have changed, and there's nothing stopping them going back out to market to see if they can get the best rate.
And so theoretically, obviously, like you said, some insurers will want you to wait 12 months if your existing policy, that is, so before they change anything. But let's say you applied now and you had a higher than normal BMI, and then in 3 months' time your BMI dropped. Could you just go and apply with somebody else elsewhere, a brand new company, and just tell them what your current truthful height and weight is at that point, will you be able to then apply for life insurance with them without having to refer to the fact that your BMI previously was that much higher?
Yes, of course you can. Your answers to questions when you apply for life insurance, critical illness cover, income protection, all have to be accurate and honest at the time of application. That's the key thing. So you need to tell them what is true at the point that they're asking you the question. And at the time that they would ask you the question, your height and weight would be accurate. You wouldn't be falsely claiming that your height and weight was different. There are questions within application forms that are designed to uncover things. So you may be asked whether you've ever been declined for insurance before. So if you had potentially been declined, you may have to say you were declined. But that doesn't change the guidelines that the insurance company uses. They really use that as a safety net to expose anything that might have been missed or, maliciously left out of an application. So if your weight has changed and you've lost weight, they'll assess you on the basis of the weight that you've disclosed. They don't try to catch you out and sort of, find that you're lying about your weight. That generally doesn't happen.
So the thing is, the whole message of this piece really is that I know that height and weight, the BMIs, are quite a sensitive subject, but specialists who you can talk to, they see loads of cases. So it's something that you should be open about. And don't forget that the advice that you get, it's actually included in the price of the product you buy anyway. So in effect, it's free in inverted commas because they're paid via commission at the back end, but it can be even cheaper than if you do just end up going via a price comparison site. So the message is, don't put things off because of you're going to get back to your fighting weight and lose weight after lockdown and things like that. When it comes to insurance products, health insurance, life insurance, critical illness, income protection, you're better off if there's a need, taking advice and applying for the products and getting it in place, because human nature is that we will put it off. And unfortunately, as Harvey said, her experience shows over the years that you could get to the point where you either can't get insurance because you do have a health problem eventually, or unfortunately something happens and you weren't able to claim because you didn't have a policy, and at that point it's all too late. So as a final question on this, Harvey, because I know you've mentioned about the BMI, and we're going to put a link to the calculator on the NHS website in the show notes, but there is a more standard measurement that we all know that we can just use as a kind of finger in the air to see if there's going to be a potential impact on an insurance application.
Yes, there is. I mean, previously, insurance companies used to look at just the BMI in isolation. As time's gone on, insurance companies have become more interested in understanding what your build is, and what they use is your waist measurement for men and your dress size for women. And generally what you'll find is that waist measurements of around 36 are acceptable. Dress sizes up to around about 16 would be acceptable. So if you're within those sort of measurements, you're likely to find life insurance without any increased premiums or any problems being accepted. Those parameters everyone knows about themselves, so those should be helpful.
So now you know, everybody who's listening, why we got Harvey to come work for Money to the Masses. Harvey is like an encyclopedia of this stuff, which I always find fascinating and we talk about. And of course, Andy and I used to work in this industry as well, which is why we pick up on these details and want people to write about them on Money to the Masses. Now, if you have any other questions about insurance, so life insurance, income protection, critical illness, health insurance, and the implications or impacts of particular health conditions, we're doing this all anonymously. Send the questions in and we'll get Harvey back on the show at a future date to go through a whole load of them, and almost like a quick fire questions to Harvey about the insurance process and likely outcomes. So Harvey, thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Damien.
We'll get you back soon. Andy, I think that's it. We're done for this week, aren't we?
Yeah, that's us pretty much done. And just on that, Damien, you mentioned about getting in touch if you've got those questions. If they are insurance related, as Damien said, why not get in touch with Harvey directly? It's harvey@moneytothemasses.com, and Harvey is spelled Harvey. If you want to get in touch with Damien about anything else, of course you can do so. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's @moneytothemasses with a number 2. And don't forget, we've also got the Facebook page as well. It's facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. You can post questions in there and learn a lot about money along the way from thousands of like-minded people. And finally, if you can find the time to review the podcast, that would be amazing because it really helps us to help more people. Damien, we are done now. That's it. We're done.
We are done. So until next time.
Until next time.